This is part 4 of Dawson, a series on the evolution of a fictional New England mill city utilizing real history. Last episode, we talked about the early industrialization of the valley, planning of Dawson, and the first Irish Catholic immigrants to Dawson. If you haven't listened to that, I recommend doing so. If you already have or just like to listen out of order, then welcome to the show. This is Dawson. I'm not a writer, I'm an engineering student. Professionally, my experience in writing comes from a technical papers kind of perspective. So, writing for storytelling doesn't exactly come naturally to me. It's not really a secret that I look up to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History series, as I've mentioned that before. I think it was the very first episode. I'm absolutely fascinated by how he does that series, and how smoothly and interesting he meanders through topics. For one, he has years of experience in journalism and radio. I've never been on the radio, nor have I ever written an article for a newspaper. Another thing is that he does it without a script. He has notes. Man, I wish I could do that. I'm terrible at improvising, and speaking especially. When I record the narration for one of these shows, I'm doing right now, I get stuck so many times on my pronunciation. Oftentimes, I'll have to do it over a line like 4 times to get it right. Though that might come from the fact that I'm reading and not speaking improvisationally. When I speak improvisationally, I get so many uhs and ums because my brain is all over the place. I have so many trails that I want to talk about and connect with other trails, but I only have one pair of legs. So instead of worrying about the story, I'm also trying to sneak in some sort of analytical thoughts here and there, since that's what I'm good at. I need to have my thoughts written down in front of me. I'm not going to solve a circuit in my head, I'm going to write down those equations. I'm only human. It's the same way for my writing, but I just write with a brain dump mindset. Writing instead of improvising while I'm speaking gives me the freedom to correct things before I say them. I also don't have the pressure to make it really interesting, since not many people watch these. Sure, I want to make it interesting, but this is more like a sandbox for me, and if people like the sandcastle I built, that's a nice bonus. The first few years of the latter half of the 19th century came with a really big growth rate in Dawson's technological abilities and investment. With this rise in the city's industry, also comes with a growth in population. St. Patrick's Catholic Church, a wooden building built for the Irish Catholic immigrants in Dawson, sees a rise in attendance, with it getting at capacity, and even sometimes overcapacity. A new, larger St. Patrick's Catholic Church is constructed as a permanent solution, creating the Annunciation of the Blessed Parish. Around this time, churches of other Christian denominations crop up as well, like the Baptist and Episcopal, from the rise in population. This is showing that Irish Catholic immigrants are the only newcomers to Dawson, now with the new town's population being 4,000, a quarter of which is of Irish background. In 1850, something big was about to happen. All across the nation, and even the world, the railroad was gaining traction. I read a book called American Railroads and British Investors. This was published in 1839 and outlined the quick growth of the railroad in the United States. Quote, "The success of these railways was so great that construction soon began to assume considerable proportions. In 1835, 1,100 miles had been built. In 1840, there were 2,800. And in 1850, 9,000 miles. And everywhere, new lines were projected and their sponsors encouraged by land grants, immunity from taxation, and other favors. The nation began to see that the presence of a railway meant production and accumulation of wealth, and that its absence rendered development impossible. As a result, railway construction was encouraged by every available means, and favored and fostered, patronized and protected by the people and their government. Railways were bound to grow at that rapid rate which had astonished the world." End quote. Its absence rendered development impossible. I love that line. Can you imagine what the board meeting between the investors must have been like? You spend tons of money to build these canals and mills, and then someone says that if you build a railway here, it's going to boost your production and make you richer. How do you say no? Soon after, the Amoskeag Railroad was finished connecting Dawson to the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, connecting Dawson to Portland, Maine, in the west, Montreal to the north, and Boston to the south. A major source of investment came from the administration of the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company, who recognized the impact that the railroad would have on the industry. Cotton from the plantations in the southern United States could now be transported cheaper and faster to the mills in Dawson, making textile manufacturing an even more lucrative business than ever before. Because of this, the amount of mills and manufacturing companies in Dawson boomed, including the Dawson Locomotive Works, which at this time is the sole supplier of locomotives for the Amoskeag Railroad. As it grew, it had the biggest share of the customer base with the railroads in mines and quarries. Along with the freight side of train transport, there were benefits of passenger transport, such as immigration of French Canadians. For our era, 1850 to around 1861, French Canadian immigration started but didn't pick up until after 1861. The Irish immigrants shared what they had for a Catholic church with the French Canadian immigrants, but because of the difference in language, French Mass would be held in the basement of St. Patrick's Church, and English Mass in the upper church. This way of operating Mass in multilingual areas is pretty common. Today in Lewiston, the Basilica of Saints Peter and Paul holds English and French Mass in the upper church, but holds Latin and Spanish Mass in the basement chapel. This practice is done as to only use as much space as necessary, considering the corresponding Mass attendance. Around 1851, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad buys a short line Amoskeag Railroad, and 2 years later, the Grand Trunk Railroad bought the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, and its Canadian counterpart, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway. These railroads, minus the Amoskeag Railroad, actually existed. The Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad was established in 1844 by an entrepreneur from Portland, Maine. Montreal recognized that it needed an ice-free port. Boston and Portland then went head-to-head in proposals to connect Montreal with their corresponding ice-free port. Montreal eventually decided that it would be best to connect to a smaller port, Portland. The Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad finished its short lengths of rail, starting with Portland to Yarmouth, Maine in 1848. Its Canadian counterpart, the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway, built its line from Montreal to Island Pond, Vermont. And then in 1853, the United States-based Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad finished its run to Island Pond, Vermont. And after only a few months, regular service was established from St. Lambert, Quebec, which is on the other side of the St. Lawrence River at Montreal. Only a few months after that run was established, the Grand Trunk Railway leased both the St. Lawrence and Atlantic Railway and the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, effectively connecting Portland, Maine to Toronto and Montreal. Sometime later after this acquisition by the Grand Trunk Railway, passenger service was established from Montreal to Dawson. Of what demand there is a trickle of French Canadian immigrants finding work in the brand new mills of New England mill cities like Dawson. These new immigrants arriving in Dawson derived from the French colonists that I've talked about before previously on the show in episodes 1 and 2. Quebec City was established in 1608 with a population of about 28 men, and slowly grew to 355 in 1640. The identity of this colony was rather unique in the New World, being French Catholic, but also in terms of the language. The French of Quebec differs from the French of France today because the two dialects split several centuries ago, with multiple reforms throughout the years for both. leading to the two languages becoming unique to each other. In the early 19th century, the French government started eradicating regional dialects of French in favor of a so-called universal French, what we now consider modern French. The dialect of the colony of New France spoke the dialect of their native region in France, such as Poitevin from Poitou, France, where a good portion of colonists to New France originally came from. Another unique aspect of Quebec's identity also stems from the first half of the 17th century. The seigneurial system was established. This was a semi-feudal system used as a tactic to gain more territory and expand the colony of New France. These lands, or seigneuries as they were called, consisted of long strips of land with the shortest part parallel to the waterways for transport. This was an economic, social, and land use system all rolled into one and lasted for quite a long time. The seigneurial system wasn't completely abolished in Quebec until 1854, and you can still see physical evidence from this today by looking at maps of rural Quebec along the St. Lawrence River. The seigneurial system is also an important piece of context to understand why French Canadians started to emigrate to New England mill cities. Rural farm lands were becoming very crowded under this antiquated system. You have the push and pull factors for French Canadian immigrants. The push factors come from Quebec, pushing them out, and the pull factors come from New England mill cities, which are attracting them. After the latter half of the 19th century, some of the factors are the failure of the seigneurial system as a push factor. The pull factor would be the rapid industrialization in places like Dawson. The industrialization in the United States was notorious to French Canada, for good and for bad, depending on who you ask. In Quebec in the United States, a historiographical survey, Yves Roby describes this, quote, "From 1840 to 1870, according to the most accurate observers, nearly 200,000 Quebecers crossed the American border. Even though these early migrations were often seasonal and temporary in character, it is easy to understand the panic they inspired among Quebec elites. The nearly 70,000 Quebecers who emigrated during the 1850s alone represented 15,000 more people than the contemporary population of Montreal, the most densely populated city in the province of Quebec. To check this hemorrhage, which in the long run threatened the very survival of French Canadian culture, the authorities debated, multiplied investigations, and encouraged the opening of new lands to agriculture and fought for the repatriation of migrants, all in vain. It was as if Quebec workers, facing unsurmountable economic difficulties, failed to see any remedy other than the call of New England factories. The image of an America paved with gold, of a promised land, reached the most remote corners of Quebec. The elites, unable to stem this tide, endeavored to discredit it. They attributed emigration with a desire for luxuries, to drunkenness, to laziness, and to improvidence. The emigre was pictured as a weakling who succumbed to the American mirage, a coward afraid of the arduous work of pioneer agriculture, a traitor to French Canada, and a simpleton. For if indeed America was rich, it was owing to the work that these new slaves who toiled and ruined their health in the unsanitary factories of New England. Emigration was the prelude to a sad and hard life, compared to the idyllic advantages offered by the Quebec countryside. American cities were shown to be the realm of internal forces, where the exiled, left to their own devices, lost their faith and their nationality." End quote. For some, the promise of a steady wage was too great to miss out on. Towards the 1860s and the 1870s, the mills were desperate for more labor as they continued to grow. Mill administrators of larger mills, who favored the hard work and cheap labor of the French Canadians, sent recruiters to Quebec to entice French Canadian farmers to work in their mill. Some French Canadians already in mill cities like Dawson wrote to family and friends still in Quebec to join them working in the mills. Those French Canadians who did so with great financial risk. While digging around for first-person accounts of French Canadians moving to the United States, I found a transcript from 1938 on an individual named David Morin, who moved from Quebec to Old Town, Maine. Here is his first-hand account. Quote, "I came here from Quebec in 1882. when I was 12 years old. There were 25 of us in the family. We had to sell our farm to get here. A cousin of the old man's, old Henry Martin of West Old Town, you remember him, wrote to us and asked us to come here and run his farm on shares. When we got here, we found that if the farm had been in Quebec, it would have been big enough to support 2 families, but it wouldn't be here. Oh yes, and the grounds are much richer up there. We couldn't all live off the farm, so some of us had to get jobs. I worked in the box mill 20 years ago before I got that job in the store. There were no immigration laws when we came here. They hadn't had those very long, you know. I don't know if the Bangor and Aroostook was running or not. You see, we came in the other way, from the western part of the state through Danville Junction. I remember we was held up for half an hour because the old man had 50 pounds too much baggage. They used to go up and get him in those days. They didn't have people enough here to run the cotton mills and factories, so they used to go up there and offer people good jobs at good wages and their fare paid to any place they wanted to go. A lot of them went to Massachusetts. I worked in Salem in a cotton mill for a while. That's quite a city, Salem. A lot of them couldn't speak English, of course. The boss used me once in a while as an interpreter. I remember once he came over to me and said, "Dave, you see that little girl over there? Her name is Marie. She just spoiled a yard of cloth. Come on and give her hell. Give her a good bawling out there and tell her it's coming from me." End quote. In mill towns like Dawson, the train station is their Ellis Island. After they would arrive in Dawson at the Grand Trunk Railway Station, they would find themselves in a completely different environment than what they've experienced before. These massive brick factories and the collective sounds from all the textile machineries from the mills would be something to experience, especially if you're coming from an agrarian town. If you ever get the chance, go to a full-size functioning weaving room in a historical mill. The sound is deafening. Apparently, these rooms can reach 100 decibels, which can and did give permanent hearing damage to workers on these floors. Another cultural shock to these immigrants would be housing, or lack thereof. Before the 1870s, immigrant housing in these cities consisted of slums made of tenement buildings. It's only after this where we start seeing real quality housing for the working class in these mills. The housing quality and the new environment was not the only issue facing French-Canadian immigrants, and in this case, even the Irish Catholics. In the mid-1850s, a political ideology called the Know-Nothing Party began to gain traction. This nationalist political movement was based on anti-Catholicism, xenophobia, and anti-immigration. Editor and curator of the Main Memory Network, Candace Keynes, describes the Know-Nothings, quote, "Some history can make us squirm. Slavery, discrimination, and treatment of Native Americans, harassment of immigrants. These are just a few of the topics that often elicit statements of horror, shock, or embarrassment. Maine, as everywhere, has its share of historical events that some people would rather not know about or might want to sweep under the rug for comfort. For instance, in the 1850s, the Know-Nothing Party was active in Maine. On October 14, 1854, Ellsworth Know-Nothings tarred and feathered Jesuit priest John Baptist and rode him out of town on a rail, in part because he objected to Catholic students having to read from a Protestant Bible. He survived the attack. Know-Nothings in Bath burned a church used by Roman Catholics on July 6, 1854. Several paintings of the event serve as reminders." End quote. Their name stems from the secrecy of their party. When questioned about their affiliation, they would say, "I know nothing." In the years following this, the Know-Nothing Party eventually severely declined after the 1856 presidential election, with the party losing dramatically to James Buchanan and carrying only a single state, Maryland. The French Canadians and Irish Catholics were threatened by these people. They see these church burnings, priests being tarred and feathered, and wonder, is this going to happen to me? Though the Know-Nothing Party dissolved in 1860, the xenophobic ideology of the Know-Nothings stayed, which we'll recognize in a few episodes. As the population grows in Dawson, the town becomes larger and increases in amenities. And in 1860, Dawson is incorporated as a city, meaning now there is a city government. Because the Irish and French Canadian residents in the town were not wealthy and didn't own land from being recent immigrants, established Protestant men were the first of the city's politicians. White's growth is positive as well, but not near Dawson's. Considering the academy, location from the tenements in Dawson, while still being in an urban location, White became a haven for the mill executives, local lawyers, and the area's general wealthy. Thanks for watching or listening to the 4th episode of Dawson. If you like this, please consider subscribing so you can be the first to know when episode 5 drops. If you would like to get in touch with me directly, you can email me at unnamednarrative@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at the handle unnamedwithmatt.